folks, Ariel over here at Finest, where today we are going to harvest the rest of the onions. Now this bed, which looks mostly empty toward that end, had onions basically down both sides the whole way. Originally there was some green beans in the middle, which, as you might remember, we lost to a freeze when it was almost July. We had a freeze down into the teens and that killed all the green beans. I did replant them. They did not really successfully. Well, they did regrow a little bit, but about the time they produced a couple beans is when we were sick. We never got them harvested and they froze again. So we didn't get any beans this year. But the onions have done really well. Now the empty part down there is ones that we've already used, either in just day-to-day cooking. A whole ton went into making salsa, which you guys, a lot of you watched that video, making a year's worth of salsa. And if you've watched stuff in the past, every year, including this year, I made a huge batch of tomato soup, spaghetti sauce, pasta sauce, whatever you want to call it. I use the same tomato sauce for all those things. And so approximately a little more than half the onions have already been used in something this year. So this is what is left. And these I am hoping to harvest for long-term storage. Now some like this, you see how that top just doesn't really want to lay over, where some are, you know, kind of dead the whole way over. I'd prefer if they were all dead the whole way over. This one would still do more growing. The only reason I'm going to harvest it regardless is because we have been getting, you know, we're now halfway through October, we've been getting killing, you know, freezes into toward the low 20s Fahrenheit for 5 weeks or so. And in the next few days, we're supposed to go into the teens with snow, and I probably won't see the ground again until spring. Now this is late for us, so normally I wouldn't have been able to even wait this long. But I know these aren't going to be able to do much more growing. If I left them in the soil over the winter, they might survive if we get enough snow to insulate the ground, and then they would sprout up a seed head the next year and try to produce seeds, which would be fine, except that what I'm wanting to do is eat these. So that one is greener than I would prefer to harvest. If you're not up against winter like I am here, I would let that continue to grow. One like this, however, is totally ready. And I could just yank these up. With a stem that dead, the stem would break off, so that would be hard to do anyway. But I also like to leave at least some of the roots of just about anything I harvest in the ground to disturb my soil as little as possible. So I'm using this little hori-hori style knife, trowel, whatever you want to call that. And if I slide it under there carefully, I can kind of cut the roots. I'm not taking all of them off, but I'm leaving some of them underground. But that's more what I'd actually prefer if they all looked like today. But they don't all. So we're going to harvest them anyway. The varieties I've planted this year, these that I'm harvesting, I believe, are all Walla Wallas. They have done very well for me many years. That one's kind of broke, so I'm just going to pull that off already. Walla Wallas have done very well for me for many years. They're one I plant pretty much every year. Down at that end, I actually have one purple onion left. I don't grow a ton of these purple ones. If the brown stuff flakes off, you can see how it's pretty purple inside, just because they don't store very well long term. But I do always grow a handful, and we usually eat them for summer things when I'm cooking. They go in salads and coleslaws and stuff like that. This is the last one. I'll probably just throw it in the house and we'll use it for something in the near future. They would keep several months, but they don't tend to store well all winter. I had planted a few candy onions as well. They are another good one. They do well here. They never get quite as large for me as the Walla Wallas. And I don't believe I have any left in the garden because I've used all of them in salsas and salsa and cooking and so on. So these are all Walla Wallas, and what variety does best in your climate will probably vary with the climate. But if you are also in a cold climate like me, that's one I highly recommend trying, because they do seem to do quite well in cold climates. So as I'm pulling these each up, if there's some of the leaves are totally dead and just kind of crumble off, I'm pulling those off, but and I can brush a little of the dirt out of the roots here. But much like the garlic, when we harvested that, because we want these to store long term, we want the onion to pull all the nutrients that are in the roots and in the leaves and everything into that bulb where it's trying to make a baby to survive the winter and to reproduce itself in the next year. So rather than cutting all the tops off and all the roots off right now, I'm going to let them cure. Very similar to what we did with garlic. And then we'll tidy them up once this stuff is all dried up. And like I said, if I could have waited and let ones that were still that green, even though its top was flopping over, dry down to be more like this brown one, I would have. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm going to go through all these, cut under them carefully. I don't want to cut into the bulb, but like I said, I know from experience. Now let's see, where's one with a good strong stem? Well, that one broke. I've had them pull soil the whole way out from the bottom of the garden bed when I pull them, because their root systems are that large, depending a little on how wet the soil is and so on. And I just would prefer not to disturb my soil that much, which is why I'm kind of cutting under them. Once again, you want to be gentle. These are still soft on the outside. This is kind of a general principle for anything that you're going to store long term. You're not going to want to bang these around or smash them into things or bruise the sides or cut them or anything. If there's any of those that happen, they're fine. You're just going to want to use them soon, not try to store them, because they will spoil and they will make everything beside them rot. So I'm just laying them gently in these crates. I had a couple of these. I think somebody sold me tomatoes in them one year, and they were very nice reusable crates. So I've been using them for years since, mostly for storing onions. So this is what I'm doing. And I don't want to cut the roots right up to the base yet either, because until some more of these layers get kind of dried up and hard and papery and sealed, I don't want any bugs or anything to go into an open wound there close to the base of the onion and make it start spoiling because of that. I want that to kind of shrivel up and seal up. I've been asked several times, how do you get large onions? Obviously, these are not all huge. That's a good size one. Some of these are pretty large. I'm very happy with our onion harvest. These dead bits of leaves. Here, our climate's so dry, they just don't break down well if I leave them in the soil. So they're all going to go in the compost pile, where with everything piled on top of each other, plus some things like duck muck water added to the top, they do break down well, and then they go back in the garden for the next year. But they just don't do that well laying on the surface of the ground in our area. The biggest thing I have found for getting larger onions is what you start them from. A lot of people start onions from sets, which look like kind of like mini little baby onion bulbs, and you plant those in the spring and they grow. Those work, they grow, but in my experience, they never ever, and this is both with ones I've planted, ones I've seen planted in friends' gardens, feedback from other people in various homesteading groups I'm part of, and so on. They never get as big as ones that you start from seed. These were all started from seeds. I did not start them myself. I have tried that in the past. I just don't have enough light in the tiny house right now to really make seed starting work. There's not enough room by windows and so on in the tiny space. One of these years we will have a greenhouse, and then I'll do it myself. In the meantime, what I've found most effective is to purchase them. Here's one that he's flopped over. He was gonna make an onion flower. He was trying to purchase them from a local greenhouse who does start them from seed. So when I buy them, they look like little grass clumps almost. And onions grow really slow. When they're starting, they grow really slow. You put a seed in the ground or in your pot or whatever indoors, and it seems to take forever. And then one little green sprig comes up that looks like a little teeny grass blade, and that just sits there and doesn't look much bigger and doesn't look much bigger and just keeps sitting there, and you think it's never ever going to grow. And then I believe the greenhouse starts them at least 2 months, 8 weeks before I buy them, and even then they look like, you can go back to other videos and watch planting in the spring, they look like little grass blades that are about that tall and all floppy, and they don't look like much. And I put them in the ground and they still don't look like much, and they don't look like they hardly grow at all. And then finally, one day, they just decide to grow leaves, and they grow up and they get these beautiful tall onion leaves, but there's still no bulb. And then they kind of always appear to me to sit there again, and they sit and sit and sit and look like there's just leaves and no bulbs. And then toward fall, for me, this may vary with your climate, they all of a sudden start to make bulbs, and they get really, really big. But this all takes forever, is what it feels like. And I have seen people discuss cutting the greens off of your onions to make them grow bigger bulbs, because if they're not putting energy into the greens, they will put more into the bulb. I don't know, to me that seems like nonsense. The greens are a great deal, of course the roots do some as well, but the greens are a great deal of what feeds the bulb to grow, the bulb. So cutting off the greens seems completely counterproductive. I've heard of people trying that. I can't say I've ever heard of anyone actually getting bigger onions by chopping off half of the plant and reducing its ability to produce nutrients and chlorophyll and all of that, and thereby actually getting a larger onion. So I don't recommend cutting your greens off your plants, and unless we're talking like we're at this stage, we're going to harvest them anyway, and sometimes I will go along and give the onion a little help on pushing the top over there, just because I need them to die back and cure out here because I'm out of time. But I do not trim greens. And as you can see, some of them are smaller, but some of these are, probably at least half are about this size. Very big, beautiful onions. Might have to put some of those on a scale and see how much they actually weigh a piece. Anyway, so that's the biggest thing I've noticed. I've just never ever seen with any variety growing them from sets, which tend to be handy and easy to plant and look less floppy than the little grass seedling seeds. Just never seem to produce nearly as large of an onion. And that's been my main observation. Of course, like all plants, they need sufficient water. Onions do soak up a good bit of moisture in the process of growing, but this doesn't have to be super wet. Our climate here is very, very dry, and obviously onions grow well for me here. I don't water them any differently than I do the rest of the garden, but I do know that if you have drier years, you often tend to get smaller and stronger flavored onions. It's like the same amount of onion flavor is in there, but it's concentrated into a smaller amount of onion flesh, and so it's more powerful. Anyway, that's the things I've observed about growing large onions over the year. A little bit like the carrots, this may be another one of those things that is helped somewhat by living in a cold climate. I don't know what onions grow best if you live somewhere very warm. I think onions are growable in warm areas, obviously people do, but they do seem to do very, very well in a cold area. So, move to the mountains of Wyoming or somewhere else over 6,000 feet. Maybe that'll help if you're really trying to grow big onions. And as I say that, I pull up a baby one who got stuck between the big guys and I guess just didn't have room to actually grow this year. Go over here, you're in the way of the camera. And once again, leaving some of that root mass in the soil seems to be beneficial, because as those roots, die off in there and decompose through the winter, they make lots of wonderful compost into the soil and little tunnel spaces for earthworms and good funguses and bacterias and archaea and all those lovely things that we need in our soil. Because that's the other thing I didn't mention, is that really I think the key to growing onions, carrots, anything else at all, any kind of plant, is that you need really healthy soil. And healthy doesn't just mean a good mineral balance, though it means that as well. You have to have, you know, amounts of all the different building blocks for a plant, but it needs all of the soil life too, because the plant cannot do many of the functions a plant needs to do all by itself. It needs funguses and microbes to make everything work. And this is why I know back when we had the flea beetle issue going on, quite a few people were like, quit being such an idiot and, you know, stuck on doing things organically and just go get a chemical spray and kill them all. You're going to lose your whole crop. Well, I did lose pretty much the whole crop of brassicas this year. We got very, very little cabbage. We'd harvested a little broccoli before the flea beetles destroyed things. But far more than any individual crop of cabbage or anything, I don't want to destroy my entire garden. And I doubt, even had I gotten a chemical spray, I could have put much of a dent in the population here, because they killed 40 acres of a field beside us. They killed a whole lot of things across the whole area this year. So I doubt anything I did in my garden would have affected the total flea beetle population this year, which is kind of a plague year for them, and hopefully we won't have that again. But more than that, what I can affect is my soils. If I had filled, you know, my garden up with any of those toxic things, I probably wouldn't have saved my cabbage. But even if I had, I would have lost years and years of healthy growth of everything else I planted for a long time, as the soil life and microbes and nematodes and all that stuff tried to recover from that poisoning. So there's no one crop that's nearly worth destroying my soil to me. In fact, I'd find doing something like that to be a bit like deciding to burn your house down because there's a spider inside. Now, I have an irrational fear of spiders myself, so I can understand the urge to do something like that possibly, but that would obviously be a rather ridiculous reaction to dealing with something and destroy something else much bigger and more complicated, just because of one little thing you don't like. Anyway, and if you want to know more about some of that stuff, I highly recommend the work of various people. If you're into watching other videos, Hugh Richards, I believe the gentleman's name is a young fellow in Britain who does a lot of work with that. A lot of his practice, he's better at putting it into words and visuals, is based on a lot of stuff, work that other people have done, like I did a review of the Regenerative Agriculture's Guide to Soil Amendments and Sprays or something like that earlier in the year. That's something I have been using, those kinds of techniques, in the last few years. Check that out. That's great. Recommend checking out John Kemp's podcast, KEMPH, PHF, something like that. If I remember, I'll link down below. He's an Amish gentleman who is one of the most brilliant men I've ever listened to discuss soil and agriculture and growing things. A lot of his podcasts and so on are geared a little bit more toward people doing this at a commercial scale, like hundreds or thousands of acres, but a whole lot of the info and the people he interviews and knowledge he shares is very applicable to things I'm doing in my little garden of 600 square feet here as well. So that's the kind of thing, if you do have questions about how do you get healthier this or better that, I recommend highly looking into some of those people's information, because that's what I've been learning from. And overall, I'd say I have found these methods to be very successful in producing a massive amount of food for our household from a very small square footage of garden in a place that technically does not have a growing season, because we don't have a first and last frost date. So now that I have these all out of the ground, I'm gonna kind of carefully arrange them through here, just laying on top of the soil where they will all have time to kind of dry in the sunshine for the rest of the day today. Now you could do this for several days. In fact, I believe that's often recommended, except I'm not going to do it for several days because we are going to get temperatures into the low 20s Fahrenheit tonight, so that's well below freezing, and I'm afraid that being out of the ground, they would actually freeze and then go mushy and be ruined when they thawed the next day. But I am going to leave them out here for the rest of today till it starts to cool off this evening. And when I get a baby one like that, he would be fine, but I am going to use him first, kind of like the baby potatoes and such. These smaller ones just don't keep as well, so we're just going to use them in cooking first, which is fine because we cook with onions all the time. But I'm going to lay them out here where they can get as much sunlight as they can, and then I'm going to move them because I can't just let them lay out here for 3 or 4 days to cure. Which you could do totally well if you're not going to be well below freezing at your place when you're doing this. I'm going to take them into the shop, into Clay's shop, and set these, I'm going to put them in those trays, and then set them not on or anything, but near the wood stove where it will be warm and dry for probably a couple weeks for them to finish curing out. And at that point it'll be like the garlic. The tops won't be green anymore, they'll be shriveled up, the roots will be shriveled up, and we will trim them up and actually put them in a crate for storage for the rest of the winter at that point. So that's what's going to go on here, and I'm just so happy with the size of some of these very, very lovely onions that our garden has produced this year. And like when I'm cleaning other things up, I pull the occasional weed or two that's in a garden bed while I do this. Oh, and I do crumble some of the soil off, but I'm not going to wash them. Very rarely does anything that's going to be cured and stored get washed with water before curing it. You want it to dry out, not be wetter. So that's our harvesting the other half of the onions for the year, the half that we have not already used.
We hope you enjoyed it.
Come back next time for more adventures.
Thanks for watching.